Perl is a scripting language, and arguably the most popular scripting language. It's object-oriented, it runs in an interpreter, and it's very common with back-end administrative type of scripting. Things like file processing, system administration. You'll see it in CGI scripts.
For web stuff?
Yeah. Web scripting. Sometimes with network programming. A lot of quick and dirty programs.
Oh, yeah.
So if you need something to just kind of move through each file in a directory and do something to it, a Perl script is the kind of a fast use.
You'll be hard-pressed to find a language that offers you a much quicker way to do something like that than Perl.
So generally speaking, if you see a program written in C, in C++, in C#, and Pascal, and Perl, and a lot of other languages, even in Java, they will basically look the same. The basic layout of the code, how blocks of code look, and how program language flows when you look at it, will generally look all the same. They've all kind of been rooted in the C language. And so this makes Perl more accessible to developers that come from that lineage of understanding.
And since Perl works so well with cross-platform compatibility, anybody that gets involved in server maintenance where you see like cron scripts and that sort of thing, a lot of times you'll see stuff like that in Perl.
Absolutely.
The next language that we're going to talk about is technically not a language, but it's extremely important to understand. Language is part of the acronym, but it's really not a programming language as much as it is a formatting language. It's used by many applications. The most common way that we see HTML as programmers is in web. Although I do want to say that it's not only used in web.
Absolutely not.
That's just its most popular
a web
implementation.
browser is the most common application to display it.
Instead of using things like declaring objects and stuff like that, which we haven't really gotten into yet, it uses a tab structure to identify objects. And most objects in HTML are either predefined in the language or an extension, whether it's some sort of ActiveX or COM object that's used on the local PC, like a Flash player, that sort of thing, is an extension. You would see Flash code in HTML, but it's not. It's added to HTML. HTML is also seen in conjunction with CSS, and that helps with dictating formatting. So instead of going through all of your elements, you can just write a basic HTML page, slap on a CSS, and then everything will just kind of fit to that format.
Also, CSS sometimes can normalize some of the differences between browsers.
Good point.
But one of the things to consider with HTML always is that HTML is not equal in all browsers. There is a standard for HTML.
And Microsoft chooses not to follow the standard.
Ever.
But every other browser, like Opera, Firefox, Chrome, pretty much work fine. But you'll find stuff that's written specifically for IE. You'll even see some JavaScript code where there's a condition that says, if you're running an IE, run this code.
You'll see that a lot.
Right, if you're running Firefox, run this code.
You see that all the time.
Oh, yeah. One thing to kind of attach to HTML is XML. It's a similar structure to HTML, but it doesn't really process and read like HTML. It basically is a standard for containing and storing objects in a tagged formatted language similar to HTML. So they are related in their syntax, but they're not really related as a language.
Right. Next is JavaScript. JavaScript is not always, but most often found to be embedded in HTML pages. So JavaScript will execute in a browser and perform logical operations and executions within a website. And this is client-side scripting. This is downloaded with the HTML code, and it will execute on your computer on the client side. And this helps to create dynamic and interactive web content. Within JavaScript, HTML elements can be declared as objects and manipulated like a C++ object is. So you have access to the HTML elements from the scripting language. And it's called JavaScript, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the language Java.
I've never really gotten a straight answer from anybody about that.
I think it was trying to coattail it. It was trying to capitalize on the growing popularity
At the time,
of
Java was exploding.
Generally speaking, you'll see this in the web and on mobile development.
Yeah, like something simple, like when you go to a website and you put your cursor over a button and it lights up, 9 times out of 10, that's the JavaScript that says that you take the object that is the image, and you say, when the cursor is on top of the object, swap it out with this image.
Right.
What do we have next?
PHP.
PHP. Now, there is an urban legend. I don't know if this is true, but I've heard this from many people that when the people that created PHP released the language, they didn't have a name for the acronym. They just called it PHP. When the language became popular, they had to think of, well, what does PHP stand for? I don't know, so let's call it PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. So, if one of the creators of PHP is listening and I'm wrong, please send me an email, because for many years that's what I've been known to believe that's what the name came from. We were just talking about client-side scripting languages. Well, PHP is a server-side scripting language. It creates dynamic HTML and JavaScript content on the web server.
So you could basically see it as when you request a web page, HTML is sent back.
Yep.
And in PHP's case, a website is requested with arguments, And based on those arguments, a certain result of HTML is returned.
Like something simple, like you can set user sessions or session variables, which is basically when you go to a website, you can have a variable that's designated to just you. So you can have things like login scripts. So if you're logged in and you've been authenticated, you can then view this script. So that's how when you go to like a social networking website like Facebook, which I think is written in PHP, when you log into your Facebook account, they can recognize who you are based on these variables that you have stored locally. One of the reasons why PHP kind of exploded, it's extremely easy integration with MySQL or MySQL has pretty much made it PHP is here to stay.
And the fact that PHP and MySQL are both open source and don't cost any money didn't hurt it either.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why we also mentioned here as part of the poor man's arsenal.
Absolutely.
So, Brian, explain to us what the poor man's arsenal is.
It's common to have a combination of an Apache instance, which is a web server, which will serve your HTML, running on Linux operating system. Apache is open source, doesn't cost anything either. MySQL, which is the database, which is in the GNU license, and PHP. You now have a web server, a database, and a way to create dynamic content. And the dynamic content usually comes from things that are stored in a database. At almost no cost, or at least at only the hardware cost, you can be up and running with a fully functional dynamic website.
And a close resemblance to the Perl syntax didn't hurt it either.
That's true.
You know, I mean, you can look at PHP code and you could easily mistake it for Perl if you didn't know some subtle things about it.
And a lot of people will actually be mistaken in thinking that PHP stands for the Perl Hypertext Preprocessor.
That's true. That's true. And you know, guys, if I am right and you guys couldn't think of a name, that would have been a very good one for you.